Episode 18, Hatfields and McCoys. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. Last week's episode was kind of rough, huh? 2 serial killers for the price of 1. Also, I do apologize that it had random music in there. I have no idea where that came from or how it got there. I always listen to my podcasts ahead of time, but I somehow missed that. But my friend Debbie, thank you so much, Debbie, is the one that pointed it out to me. So hopefully I got it fixed now, so it won't sound so strange. Anyways, I am sorry about that. But today, let's cover the Hatfields and McCoys. I totally should turn my Appalachian card in for this one, but I really don't know anything about them, but that they feuded. Like the most I know about them is from Bugs Bunny cartoons, and I'm only about an hour or so drive away from where they are. So I guess I should really know more. I know that's pretty bad. So if you, like me, don't really know about them, let's discover it together. Wikipedia says the Hatfield-McCoy feud involved 2 American families on the West Virginia-Kentucky area along the Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River from 1863 to 1891. The Hatfields of West Virginia were led by William Anderson, Devil Anse Hatfield, while the McCoys of Kentucky were under the leadership of Old Randall McCoy, or he also went by Randall. Those involved in the feud were descended from Joseph Hatfield and William McCoy, born circa 1750. The feud has entered into the American folklore lexicon as a metonym for any bitterly feuding rival parties. But let's look into the story deeper. The Tug Fork Valley was the edge of the American frontier in the early 1800s. The Tug Fork River stretches 159 miles from close to the Virginia state line in McDowell County, West Virginia, to Louisa, Kentucky, where it joins the Louisa Fork to form the Big Sandy River. Because of this, the Tug Fork is considered to be part of the Mississippi watershed. I think this is a bit of cool trivia. The Tug Fork is one of the rare rivers that flow north. So that's kind of cool. I don't know how they determine it or why that does that, but that's just what I read. So, the origins of its name were noted by toponymist George R. Stewart, as in 1756, a small army of Virginians and Cherokees conducted war raids against the Shawnee. At one point, they killed and ate 2 buffalo and hung their hides from a tree. They later took these hides and cut them into thin strips called tugs. Stewart noted another possible origin, perhaps more accurate. In the Cherokee language, Tougaloo refers to the forks of a stream, as in the Tougaloo River and other streams in former Cherokee lands named Tug. The river flows through an especially remote mountainous region in its upper course, the river valley between Pike County, Kentucky, and Mingo County, West Virginia, and it was the spot that was the scene of the Hatfield-McCoy feud in the late 19th century. So this area of the Tug Fork Valley, there were mountains on each side, and settlements were primarily on the valley on the hills. The Tug Fork is a shallow waterway. When they originally settled, Kentucky was on one side and Virginia was on the other. And I've seen pictures of this, and it is like a really steep valley with just a little bit of area, really, for people to live. But, of course, people make a way whenever they need to settle somewhere. The Hatfields and McCoys were some of the earliest white settlers in the valley. The Hatfields originally came to America from the town of Hatfield in Yorkshire, England. Matthias Hatfield made it to America in the 1660s. He started out in New Haven, Connecticut, and then moved to Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Matthias found success owning several tanneries in the area. He had several children, and the family continued to grow in the area. They were pretty well-to-do for that time. George Hatfield, Matthias's great-grandson, moved to Virginia and started up a family of his own. George's family expanded throughout the area. By the time his great-great-grandson, Ephraim, had come along, he had moved to Logan County, West Virginia, which was Virginia at the time. Ephraim, who was called Eaf of all, E-A-F of all, they all had nicknames back then for some reason. He had 2 wives. First one, Mary, as she died in the late 1780s, early 1790s. He had several children with her before she died. Then he got together with his second wife, Anna, in the 1790s. He lived with her for 30 years before marrying her, and they had several children also. Ephraim had 16 children, and one of those was William Anderson Hatfield, also known as Devil Anse. He was born in 1839 on the Virginia side of the river. He went by Devil Anse, and for what I could tell, there isn't a clear reason why he was named this, but there are several theories. I guess he was a fierce hunter and had reportedly killed a mountain lion as a boy. Some say this is why he was given the name Devil Anse. Other story says his mom nicknamed him that. Although, can you imagine how bad of a child you'd have to be that your mom nicknamed you Devil? Some of the other some said that Randolph McCoy gave him the name. It's also rumored that while he got the name during the Civil War, but most likely it was because he had a cousin named Ants who went by Preacher Ants. So most likely he just took the name on so it wouldn't be so confusing. And I guess Devil Ants is kind of a cool name, I reckon. Devil Ants had 13 children with his wife, Leviza Chafin. He became the patriarch of the Hatfield family. Devil Anse was a supporter of the Confederacy leading up to and during the Civil War, as most were in the area. He commissioned as a first lieutenant in the cavalry. He later became captain of Company B, and he spent most of his time patrolling the border against bushwhackers sympathetic to the Union, as well as engaging in guerrilla warfare against Union soldiers. Devil Anse had been connected to killings of several Union fighters, including trackers Axon, Fleming, Hurley in 1863. I don't really know who they were, but they mentioned it in this article, so I assume that they must have been someone, someone of some importance. But all of this is to say that he was a really good fighter. Devil Anse and his uncle Jim Vance later formed a Confederate guerrilla fighting unit called the Logan Wildcats. One of the group's victims was Union General Bill France, killed in revenge for losing one of the members of France's unit. Losing one of their members to France's unit, I'm sorry. In 1865, he was suspected of having been involved in the murder of his rival Asa Harmon McCoy, who had fought for the Union Army and was waylaid by the Wildcats on his return home. Hatfield had been home ill at the time of the killing, which was probably committed at the instigation of his uncle, Jim Vance. This may have sparked the beginning of a notorious feud between the two families, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. Devil Anse deserted the Confederate Army in 1864 and returned home to his family in West Virginia, where he began acquiring land. Despite being illiterate, he managed to build a profitable lumber business, much of which was on thousands of acres of virgin timberland he had won in a lawsuit from McCoy relative Perry Klein. Side note, deserting the war was not that uncommon at the time. In my family, we have a Captain Richard Blazer. He actually deserted his men during battle, went back to Galley County, and eventually became the sheriff. So desertion wasn't the same as then as it was in later times. And maybe it's just because it was nation fighting, or not nation, the states fighting states. I don't know, but it wasn't as big of a deal then. But that's the Hatfield family, leading up to Devil Anse, who's, like I said, the head of the Hatfield clan and a major player in this story. Next, let's talk about the McCoys. The McCoys were originally from Scotland, and somewhere along the line, they made it to Ireland before immigrating to the U.S. in the 1700s. John McCoy settled in Maryland. John McCoy had a sizable fortune, left money to his son Archibald and his wife Elizabeth Blair. There isn't much information on the McCoy family as there was on the Hatfields, but Archibald and Elizabeth had several children. They had a child named John McCoy, who moved to Virginia with his wife, and they had several kids. This John McCoy, the father of Daniel, the grandfather of Randall, was in the Revolutionary War, and he earned a special parcel of 200 acres in Kentucky. This was the border of the Tug Fork, where they moved and settled. He had a son named Daniel who had 13 children. One of those children was Randolph McCoy, called Randall or Randall. Randall grew up in a farm near the Hatfields. He and his family moved to the area and settled on both sides. Randall then became the patriarch of the family when Daniel died. Randolph McCoy married his first cousin, Sarah Sally McCoy, daughter of Samuel McCoy, and Elizabeth Davis on December 9th, 1849 in Pikeville, Kentucky. Randall and his wife Sally had 16 children. 16, isn't that crazy? Randall McCoy was a decade older than Anderson Devil Anse. Randall McCoy later moved across the Tug River to Kentucky with his wife and family. At first, both families had members married to each other, and they were good neighbors, got along well. There was harmony and strength in the valley, but in April 1861, the Civil War broke out, and everything kind of changed. It wasn't just the Civil War, it was just kind of the beginning. It was like a beginning catalyst of everything. As I said earlier, this part of Kentucky and Virginia were more Confederate than Union. But they were like many areas, brothers fighting brothers, and some of the McCoys were Union. I don't know that the Hatfields had any Union members though. They kind of seemed to be staunch Confederacy. But Ants and many of the families enlisted in the Confederate Army as Virginia seceded, but Kentucky had sided with the Union Army. However, in this part of Kentucky, they were still primarily Confederacy, and in the McCoy family, Randall signed up for the Confederacy, but two of his brothers joined the Union. Asa Harmon McCoy was one of those brothers. To muddle things up even further, in 1863, West Virginia became a new state and sided with the Union. This began to create a lot of animosity. I mentioned earlier that Ants had left the irregular militia and joined a local militia that was more of a guerrilla army. Because of this, people were so divided, they began battling each other across the river, farms were raided, livestock was killed, and all of that. I'd mentioned earlier that Randall McCoy's brother, Asa, was on the Union side of the war. Somewhere along the way, Asa had broken a leg and was put out of the army because of that and returned home. And then somewhere along the way, Asa was murdered by the militia. Randall had blamed Ants himself, but Ants was at home at the time. Like I said earlier, he was supposedly sick. But a friend of Hatfield McCoy, Wheeler Wilson, is said to have been the one that killed him, and was rumored to be acting under their orders, especially that of his uncle Jim Vance. This is considered to be one of the possible reasons that the feud was began. But there were more fights that decade. No more fights that decade. The next time there was an altercation was in 1872. In 1872, the dispute was over illegal logging and involved Perry Klein, an extended member of the McCoy family. His sister was the widow of Asa McCoy, who was killed by the Hatfields. It really started much earlier than that, though. It began in 1861. Devil Anse Hatfield had began trespassing on the Klein lands around Grapevine Creek by taking valuable timber off the land. Hatfield had taken advantage of the fact that Jacob Klein Sr. had died in 1858, leaving the owners of this tract of land to two young orphans, Jacob Jr., age 14, and Perry, age 12. Devil Anse claimed that he held the title to this land through a survey by his father. However, no such survey has ever been produced. In 1869, a meeting was held at the mouth of Grapevine Creek. And Grapevine Creek, by the way, we'll come back into the story a little bit. But the meeting appeared to be more formality. According to Jacob Jr., Devil Anse was trying to take his land by the muzzle of a gun. Perry relented and sold his half to Devil Anse, but Jacob Jr. refused. By 1870, Devil Anse had built a house on Grapevine Creek and moved there with his family and children from their prior home on Mate Creek. I guess it's Mate, M-A-T-E. Maybe it's Matty. Who knows? You can see Devil Anse living down the river as Perry's closest neighbor in the 1870 Logan County federal census. By 1871, Devil Anse had still not paid for the purchase price to Perry Klein for the Grapevine Creek lands. It is not known what kind of pressure was put on Perry Klein and his young family, but in 1871, Perry again agreed to trade Devil Anse his portion for the Grapevine lands, as well as his inheritance of the old home place, the Klein Homestead property, for a piece of land on the Tug River in Pike County, Kentucky. By 1872, Devil Anse moved from Grapevine Creek and into the Klein Homestead on the Tug. Soon after, Devil Anse traded lands with Perry Klein and moved into the Klein Homestead. Devil Anse surveyed the property himself, although he was not known as a surveyor and could not read or write. So basically, he just decided it was his. But he did specifically testify in a sworn deposition that he ignored the county surveyor's lines and created his own. So I guess he just did what he wanted and nobody really much cared. Because of all this, Perry Klein was accused by Anse of cutting down trees from his side of the woods, although he still owned 5,000 acres of his own land, so why would he even do that? But Anse took him to court, and it was settled out of court 5 years later. Klein lost all of his property and left Tug Valley. But don't forget about Perry Klein. We'll definitely be talking about him later on, several times. Next, in the fall of 1878, Randall McCoy saw that one of his pigs got with Floyd Hatfield's lands. Pig ears, I guess, were marked, much like branding a cow, but they were cut with different shapes on the ear for each farmer. McCoy saw one of his markings and tried to get the hog back, but Floyd Hatfield refused. This was a major offense at the time because the hog could feed a family over the winter. So McCoy took him to court, The justice of the peace was a Hatfield. His name was Preacher Ants. But Randall McCoy trusted him, and as he was fair and just. Preacher Ants really did try to make a fair trial. The jury had 6 McCoys and 6 Hatfields on it. Unfortunately, these families were so entwined. One witness was related to both, Bill Staten, and he actually was Randall's nephew. Bill Staten was a witness for Floyd Hatfield, though, and he stated Floyd never stole a pig from the McCoy land. Unfortunately, one of the McCoy jurors was Selkirk McCoy. Selkirk worked for Devil Ants. After hearing Bill Staten's testimony, Selkirk sided with the Hatfields. Selkirk was also dating a Hatfield, so probably not a fair trial to begin with. The statement helped Selkirk decide Floyd's fate by finding him not guilty. And the trial was over. After the trial was over, Selkirk was gifted a large amount of land from Devil Ants for being a loyal employee. Lucky him, I guess. 2 years later, after the hog trial, Bill Staten was killed by his own cousins, Sam and Paris McCoy. They were tried for murder in a court full of Hatfields, but both pled self-defense. It's said that Devil Ants wanted them to go free to prevent an all-out war. Both brothers were found not guilty due to there being no evidence. And guess who the lawyer was? Perry Cline. Yes, that Perry Cline I was just talking about earlier. He left the area after he lost his land and became a lawyer. And he'll pop back up several times here. So the next part, a lot of people are familiar with, or at least know the basic part. Rosanna McCoy fell in love with John Z. Hatfield, the daughter of Randall and the son of Ants, like a Romeo and Juliet. Well, not so much. From what I can tell, John Z was basically a player. He had tons of women and always messing around. But Rosanna was innocent and naive. When they met, she fell in love with him, but I don't know that he ever loved her. She fell in love with John Z during a passionate encounter at the spring election in 1880. Back then, elections were great social events. Men came to swap goods and stories, to drink and laugh, and the women used it as their chance to visit and gossip. There's another election coming up where something really bad happened, but let's start with Rosanna and John Z. Rosanna was 19 at the time and John Z was 18. John Z was known for being a romantic and fixated his attention on the beautiful Rosanna, despite the potential consequences of their romance. Rosanna, considered one of Pike County's most beautiful girls, sauntered away into the nearby bushes with John Z. The two returned hours later when the sun was beginning to set, and Rosanna realized that her brother Tolbert had left for home without her. Panic-stricken and with fear in her eyes, she turned to her new lover, John Z, and he rose to the occasion, suggesting that she come home with him to the Hatfield cabin, promising marriage. John Z convinced Rosanna to come live with him, but Devil Ants did not agree to their union. In fact, he was far from pleased at the idea of the couple's marriage, which, I can't really blame him, knowing their history. Then something unexpected happened. Rosanna ended up pregnant. Even John Z was not happy with this, purportedly being upset with that his blood was mixed with the McCoys. So, why did you sleep around with her then? But whatever the reason, he wanted her gone. Also, Rosanna was torn between her family and her lover and returned to the McCoy clan for a short time, allegedly because of John Z's infidelity. Her stay with her family was very short, though, because her father didn't approve. So she went to her aunt's house in Stringtown, Kentucky, which was close to the Hatfields. Rosanna sought to rekindle her relationship with John Z. Her brothers did not like this idea at all and captured John Z, stating they were going to take him to Pikeville on some outstanding warrants. Rosanna knew her brothers wouldn't take him and figured that they would kill him on the way. So she went to Ants to warn him. She even helped to lead a band of Hatfields to rescue him from her brothers. Despite her clear defiance of her own family, John Z did not resume his relationship with the pregnant Rosanna. He was afraid after that to be caught with her again and face her family. Randall refused to let her come back with them, so she moved back with her Aunt Betty. Shortly after moving in with Aunt Betty, she gave birth to her baby, but it died of measles at 8 months of age. Then 6 months after her baby's death, John Z married Rosanna's cousin Nancy McCoy, who was 16 at the time. After the baby's death, Rosanna began a job as governess for none other than cousin Perry Cline, who's now a lawyer moving up the ranks of Kentucky. This ends Rosanna and John Z's romance and the story, but not the feud between the two families. Hosanna's brothers were still salty about the whole situation, and one of her brothers, Tolbert, picked a fight with Bad Lias Hatfield. So here's a confusing thing. There was Devil Ants and also Preacher Ants. Preacher Ants was good and fair. Bad Lias was Preacher Ants' brother, but Devil Ants had a brother named Good Lias. Confused yet? Well, Bad Lias had nothing to do with Hosanna, but Tolbert thought he was the one of that group. But once they got the Bad Lias, they realized that, however, Ants' brother Ellison was there and did get into the fight. Tolbert started stabbing at him and his brothers, Farmer and Bud. Bud McCoy jumped in. Bud was only 15 at the time. Tolbert and Bud stabbed Ellison a number of times, but it was Farmer who ended up killing him by shooting him. That happened on Election Day in 1882. See, there's Election Day yet again. Authorities soon apprehended the McCoys. Preacher Ants wanted to send the boys to Pikeville jail, but they were ambushed by Devil Ants and his men. They interceded, taking them into Hatfield territory. Devil Ants was out for revenge. He took them to the river and tied them in a pawpaw bush and killed them. At first, they weren't going to kill Bud because he was only 15, but then Devil Ants decided to kill him too. I read one thing where their mother was there trying to stop it, and I don't know if that's true or not, but anyways, they were tied to the pawpaw bushes and gunned down. Can't get much more Appalachian than being tied to a pawpaw bush. If you aren't familiar with what a pawpaw is, it's kind of like an Appalachian banana or kiwi. I've had them before. They're not my favorite thing, but my Uncle Luke used to love them, so my dad and I would always go pawpaw hunting. But there's actually a yearly festival up at Athens, Ohio, called the Pawpaw Festival. But I digress. Let's get back to the Hatfields and McCoys. After the three McCoy brothers were killed, local law made no attempts to arrest the Hatfields, even though there were more than 20 indictments. Though the Hatfields might have felt their revenge was warranted, the law felt otherwise, quickly returning indictments against 20 men, including Devil Ants and his sons. Despite the charges, the Hatfields eluded arrest, leaving the McCoys boiling with anger about the murders and outraged that the Hatfields walked free. The charges against the Hatfields were reinstated. There were rewards for the rest of the Hatfields, including Devil Ants. Soon another McCoy, the second son of the murdered Asa, named Larkin McCoy, was ambushed by an alleged West Virginia posse led by the Hatfields. Even at that, they just kind of let it go, though Randolph McCoy was very, very angry about it. He didn't want to retaliate. I think he was just hoping for peace. Everything was okay for a few years, and then the Hatfields struck again. With the pressure cooker gathering again, the media started to report the feud in 1887. In their accounts, the Hatfields were often portrayed as violent backwoods hillbillies who roamed the mountains stirring up violence. The sensationalist coverage planted the seed that the rivalry became cemented in the American imagination, and what had been a local story was becoming a national legend. The Hatfields may or may not have been paying attention to these stories, but they were certainly paying attention to the bounty on their heads. Right around the time Cap Hatfield, local sheriff and Ance's son, and family friend Tom Wallace broke into the house of Bill Daniels and flogged his wife Mary, sister of Jeff McCoy, who they suspected of warning her brother's family of danger. Jeff McCoy heard the whipping in 1886 while on the run for the murder of mail carrier Fred Wolford. This is all just craziness. But infuriated, he and his friend Josiah Hurley set out to capture Tom Wallace and take him to jail at Pikeville, but he escaped them. As Jeff tried to flee, he was shot dead by Cap and Wallace on the banks of the Tug Fork. Two other McCoys, Jake and Larkin, once again attempted to arrest Tom Wallace for the assault of Mary Daniels in August of 1887. But he managed to escape from jail. He was found murdered the following year, likely by the McCoys. Lark McCoy was the second son of murdered Asa McCoy. He too was ambushed and murdered by an alleged West Virginia posse led by the Hatfields. Once again, the Hatfields were going to get away with it. But in comes Perry Cline again. Perry was the uncle of Mary and Jeff McCoy. At this point, Perry had become very rich and powerful and was a friend with the governor of Kentucky, Simon Buckner. Cline decided to revive the indictments for the murders of the three brothers, and it was served. So that was the murders back at the pawpaw bushes. So at this time, Pikeville, Kentucky, and Logan, West Virginia, were going through an economic boom, and timber and natural resources. Steamboats were traveling the river. The governor did not want some local feud going on to scare off investors. I'm sorry. So, and it helped his voter base also by protecting people of Kentucky from the devilish West Virginians. He had sent orders to extradition to West Virginia. He also sent a special deputy and bounty hunter, Frank Phillips, to capture them. There was a fairly big bounty at this point. The Hatfields threatened Klein, but that didn't work. He had too much clout in the Kentucky government at this point. West Virginia Governor Willis Watson didn't want to let the Hatfields go, in part because he didn't want to be seen as sending his constituents to the enemy. If the Hatfields would have stayed quiet, they probably would have gotten away with it. But they wouldn't let it be, and that was their downfall. So January 1st, 1888, Cap Hatfield, Uncle John C. Vance, and 10 others attacked Randolph McCoy's home. They thought if they killed them all, there'd be no one to testify against them. So they set the house on fire and shot everyone who left. Randall's son Calvin was shot and killed protecting the family. Randolph's daughter Alifair McCoy was shot trying to put the fire out. And also Randall McCoy's wife, Sarah, was attacked and severely beaten. She ended up with a crushed skull, which affected her the rest of her life. She eventually had to be committed to a mental asylum. Randall had fled, escaping into the woods. Or fled. I guess that's the proper word there. I didn't realize I said that. Doesn't quite seem a noble thing to do, leaving your family as they're being killed and beaten. But whatever. This became known as the New Year's Day Massacre. This made a national sensation all over the news. Suddenly, public opinion shifted against the Hatfields. A few days after the New Year's Massacre, a posse led by Pike County Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips rode out to track down Ance's group across the state line into West Virginia. Phillips began his work with glee and was excited about the new names on the list. Although he lacked properly executed extradition papers, this was known as the Battle of Grapevine Creek. See, I said Grapevine Creek would come back. 2 McCoys were members of Phillips' posse, Bud and one of Randolph's sons, James Jim McCoy. The posse's first victim was Vance, who was killed in the woods, and after he refused to be arrested, Phillips then made other successive raids on Hatfield's homes and supporters, capturing and killing many others. Well, I guess this says another 3, and not many others. Another 3 Hatfield supporters, before cornering the rest in Grapevine Creek on January 19th. Unfortunately for Phillips, Ance and the other Hatfields were waiting for them with an armed group of their own. A battle ensued between the two parties, and the Hatfields were eventually apprehended. A deputy, Bill Dempsey, was wounded and executed by Frank Phillips after they surrendered. On August 24th, 1888, 8 of the Hatfields and their friends were indicted for the murder of Randolph's young daughter, Alifair McCoy, and who was killed during the New Year's Massacre. This included Cap, John C., Robert and Elliot Hatfield, Ellison Mounts, French Ellis, Charles Gillespie, and Thomas Chambers. The West Virginia governor sued Kentucky for an unlawful extradition. Because of the issues in due process and legal extradition, the United States Supreme Court actually became involved. The case was Mahan versus Justice, if you want to know. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of Kentucky, holding that even if a fugitive is returned from the asylum state illegally instead of through lawful extradition procedure, no federal law prevents them from being tried. So they lost that fight. So I've looked for information on the trial, but really couldn't find much, probably because they were so obviously guilty they didn't really need much discussion over it. But this is what I could find. The trials began in the summer of 1889 in Pikeville, Kentucky. The outcome was that 9 of the Hatfields and their friends, or gang, whatever you want to call it, were found guilty. 8 of them were sent to prison for life. Some of those were John C. Hatfield, sweet Rosanna's baby daddy. And I have a little bit more about John Z in a little bit here. Also, Valentine, Uncle Wall Hatfield, elder brother of Ance, and Valentine died in prison of unknown causes. Pliant Mahon, son-in-law of Valentine, served 14 years in prison before returning home to rejoin his ex-wife, who had remarried, but she left her second husband to live with Pliant again. Now that's true love, isn't it? And Doc D. Mahon's son-in-law of Valentine and brother of Pliant, one of the 8 Hatfields convicted, served 14 years in prison before returning home to live with his son Melvin. One was executed, and this one I kind of feel bad about. Ellison Cotton Top Mounts was executed by hanging and buried in an unmarked grave within sight of the gallows. Ellison was believed to be the illegitimate son of Ellison Hatfield. He was the brother of the Hatfield family patriarch Deverell Ants. And if you remember, in 1882, Mount's father was killed by 3 of Randall McCoy's sons. That was the story where they were tied to the pawpaw bush and killed. I know, it's so intertwined, this stuff. It's crazy to keep track of it all. But Ellison Mounts had pleaded guilty, but had tried to retract his confession, stating that he was innocent and that he had only confessed because he expected leniency. But his retraction was denied. The thing I felt bad about this is they said he was intellectually disabled. So, of course, the one that couldn't understand as much about what was going on was executed. I'm not saying he wasn't guilty, he probably was, but it's just sad that he was the only one who was killed for what he did. He supposedly was the one who killed Alifair, but who knows? Thousands attended his hanging in Pikeville. But though the scaffold was out in the open, the base was fenced in to comply to laws that had been passed, which prohibited public executions. So, I mean, they still could probably see pretty much everything. The hanging site is currently the location of a classroom building at present-day University of Pikeville. With his last words, Ellison claimed that the Hatfields made me do it. The Hatfields made me do it. No one had been sent to the gallows in Pike County for 40 years, and after Ellison, no one ever was again. But that pretty much ended the feud between the Hatfields and McCoys. They never really argued again. The feud lasted for about a total of 30 years. So what happened with everyone? Randall McCoy and Devil Ants both escaped physically unharmed and lived as free men. Seems like Ants had always escaped harm, but in 1889, Ants did agree to show up to court to stand trial for selling illegal whiskey in exchange for not having to stand trial for the other warrants. I don't think anything ever came out of it, though. I mean, like, he didn't serve any time or anything, so unfortunately got away with it all. Poor Rosanna herself died young. After tending her mother's wounds from the New Year's Day raid, Rosanna grew more and more depressed, slipping away from life soon after. Less than 30 at her death, she lies buried in the Dills Cemetery in Pikeville. In a twist of fate, John Z. Hatfield, convicted separately and later than the others for the crimes, was pardoned because he saved the life of Lieutenant Governor William Pryor Thorne as he was attacked by an inmate during the official's prison inspection. John Z's wife Nancy had long since left him and divorced him. But get this, guess who Nancy McCoy married? She married Frank Phillips. That's right, the Frank Phillips that led the posse that captured the Hatfields after New Year's Day massacre. I just think that's crazy, like how entwined everybody is. The two had a child together and married in 1895. They both died young. Frank was shot to death in a fight at the age of 36 in 1898, while Nancy passed away from tuberculosis 3 years later, also at the age of 36. John Z. remarried twice, to Rebecca Browning, then to Jeanette Brookshire. John C's conviction was one of the few successful ones at the time of the feud, and even though he remained free for the majority of his life, still, at least he got, he was found guilty. He died in 1922. Cap Hatfield. Cap was the one that was sheriff at the time. He went on to become an attorney and a father of Logan County's first woman lawyer, which is kind of cool, but he was never charged with any other crimes, even though he was his father, Devil Ants' right-hand man. But it's said that he sought out peace later in his life as a farmer, and he was the last of the Hatfields involved in the feud to die, dying in Baltimore in 1930. While the smoke cleared, there remained the greatest irony of all. With all the bloodshed around them, both Devil Ants and Old Randall were left unharmed. Both lived well into their 80s. After the trials, McCoy seemed to live a quiet life in Kentucky. He operated a ferry in Pikeville for some time. By all accounts, he continued to be haunted by the deaths of his children, Randolph McCoy died from burns from a cooking fire after he had fallen into a fireplace at the age of 89 on March 28, 1914. From what I can tell, the fire actually happened in the fall, and he didn't die until the spring. At 89, he had to have been a tough old man to live that long. I just can't imagine. He's buried in the Dill Cemetery in Pikeville, next to his wife, who died in the 1890s. After the commotion, Devil Anse bought some land in a more remote location known as Island Creek, and there he took special measures to avoid capture. He'd always been an atheist, and at one point said, "I belong to no church unless you say that I belong to the one great church of the world. If you like, you can say it is the devil's church that I belong to." But he was born again later in life. He was baptized in 1911. Anse lived peacefully on his farm in Island Creek where he raised hogs. He did give one interview after all that happened, but then he just kind of faded into obscurity. He remained a crack shot until the end, and he reportedly carried a rifle with him wherever he went. And he went on to find a Church of Christ congregation in West Virginia. He was an uncle to the eventual governor of West Virginia and United States Senator Henry Hatfield. Anse died on Thursday, January 6, 1921, in Sarah Ann, Logan County, West Virginia, at the age of 81, of pneumonia at his home along Island Creek. He's buried at the Hatfields Cemetery along West Virginia Route 44 in southern Logan County. His grave is topped by a life-size statue of himself made of Italian marble. His wife Levacy outlived her husband by 8 years. Although the conflict subsided generations ago, the names Hatfield and McCoy continue to loom large in the American imagination. People still are fascinated by the story. In the 1970s, the Hatfields and McCoys actually went on the Family Feud game show and battled each other for money. And then great-grandsons Bo McCoy and Ron McCoy of Randolph McCoy organized a joint family reunion of the Hatfield and McCoy families in 2000. The garnered national attention. More than 5,000 people attended. On June 14, 2003, in Pikeville, Kentucky, the McCoy cousins partnered with Rio Hatfield of Waynesboro, Virginia, to declare an official truce between the families. Rio Hatfield said that he wanted to show that if these two families could reach an accord, others could also. The Hatfields and McCoy Reunion Festival and Marathon are held annually in June, a 3-day weekend. The events take place in Pikeville, Kentucky, Matewan, West Virginia, and Williamson, West Virginia. The festival commemorates the family feud and include a marathon and half marathon. The motto is "No feuding, just running." In addition to an ATV ride in all 3 towns, there's also a tug-of-war across the Tug Fork tributary near which the feuding families lived, a live reenactment of scenes from the famous fight, a motorcycle ride, live entertainment, Hatfield McCoy landmark tours, a cornbread contest, pancake breakfast, arts, crafts, and dancing. So that sounds kind of fun. In the 2000s, a 500-mile all-terrain vehicle trail system, the Hatfield McCoy Trail, was created around the theme of the feud. So the feud has long since gone to the wayside, and they're thankfully doing good things now. I usually go into things to do in the area, but this is already super long. I'm sorry about that, so I'll just skip that for now. I like this one. I learned a lot doing it, so I learned a lot I didn't know, and now I do know. So hopefully you learned some too. It wasn't just a Looney Tunes feud. I hope that y'all enjoyed this one as much as I did. As always, thank you for listening. Follow me on social medias under Poison Appalachia. I have a website now, poisonappalachia.com, and I'm selling some merch on Zazzle if you're interested. You can find the link on my website or my Facebook page. So have a good weekend, or good week, and I'll talk to y'all next week. Bye, y'all.